Good morning, or should I say good afternoon. My name is John Boyle, and you're very welcome to the Recruitment and Belbin webinar. This is the third in our series of webinars, which happen monthly, when we look at the introduction to Belbin and the team roles that Belbin in his research has identified. But in this case, we're going to turn the spotlight for the second half of the webinar onto recruitment itself. One of the things with the Belbin profile is that it's always useful to know what its uses are. And in this occasion, rather than looking at some of the team roles in great depth, we're going to actually look at some of the practical applications. I should say as a start that we do have two previous webinars in the series that provide a general introduction to the Belbin webinar process and indeed the Belbin methodology in depth. So they're all available on our website. You're all very welcome, and each of you will receive an email with a link to the website roughly 2 to 3 hours after the webinar is complete. For those of you who have not used the GoToWebinar system before, you should on your right-hand side have a menu that talks you through webcam, audio, messages, and questions. And if you have any questions that you have, you could indicate by putting up your right hand. And Rory, if you could demonstrate that now, that would be great.
Yeah, so if you look beside your name, there's a small icon with a hand. I'm not able to do it now myself, but if you click on the hand icon, it'll raise your hand and just indicate to us that you want to say something. Also, if you can unmute yourself if you right-click on your name, or else click on the microphone icon if you want to say something. And that's basically it. If you're having trouble hearing us or seeing the slides, you can just send me a chat message, and I'll try and help you out. And yeah, that's basically it.
Okay. All right. Well, good morning again, and I'll move straight into the introduction. And I'll, by the miracles of science, Rory will now give me control, and hopefully I'll be able to start that process. So you're all very welcome again. As I said, my name is John Boyle, and I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Peter Lancaster of Belbin Associates. Hello, Peter.
Hi, John. Nice to be with you. Yeah, all okay. A bit grey and miserable in Cambridge. We're getting either very cold days and then nice sunny days. You know.
Right. Well, we have been scraping the ice off the car for the first time, but it's been unseasonably mild in Ireland, and we don't really know what to do, to be honest with you. So we're hoping to carry on. And we have a light rather than a white Christmas, but I'm sure my kids wouldn't be in favour of that. So thanks. And Rory Hackett is here, who looks after our technical issues.
So John, just I'll control the slides because they're
okay. No problem at all. That makes life much.
Okay.
Okay. So we're going to look, as I said at the beginning, at Belbin and the 9 team roles. We're going to quickly look at them. We're going to look at some of the uses of the profile, and then for the second half of the webinar, we're going to look at recruitment and how the roles can actually help. So it's going to be very practical, and it's going to focus on 3 things. First of all, the relationships between an individual and their boss, a superior, and their reportee, and how looking at the 2 profiles can help that. We're then going to look at the job reports, which is to do really with how a job is recruited in the first place and what people should look for, and then a comparison between the role and the person who's applying for it, and trying to see if there are any events that could be spotted and tendencies that need to be looked at, or indeed even heightened during that. It's important to emphasize that this isn't a one-size-fits-all scenario. And just because a Belbin profile is different from another Belbin profile doesn't necessarily mean there won't be a match. In fact, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that opposites attract, and I'll be speaking to Peter about that later on, because sometimes somebody who is very, very good at what we describe as complete a finisher or implementing, it's good to have somebody who's a plant and a shaper, so a go-getter or a driver, for those of you not familiar with the methodology, to really help them. And sometimes a combination of the two can be very, very helpful. So occasionally the opposite can actually work. If you have any questions, we're there, we're ready to speak to them. So without any further ado, I'll move on to the next slide, please, Roy. We are Belbin Ireland, and as of from September the 1st, 2014, we're the sole distributors for Belbin on the island of Ireland. As you see, we've covered all 4 politically correct provinces on the map there. And what we're here to do is to provide guidance on how to apply Belbin in real team situations, to provide training for accreditation and professional practitioner, to provide profiles, reports, and other support to coaches and trainers if they're officially accredited. We're also, however, have a small bit of a policeman role, which is advising on plagiarism and upgrade schemes for those using unofficial material. We're aware that some people will be using old or paper-based material, which is now at best redundant and is in fact no longer authorized. So there's an upgrade scheme for those of you, if you're aware of people who have the paper version. You should get in contact with us and we will attempt to bring them into the modern world, because the modern world is a fully online system which is giving us the real breadth that Belbin offers. And finally, we ourselves will also intervene in the team intervention using the Belbin methodology as a consultant. There's more information on belbin.ie, or you can email us at info@belbin.ie. And I should say, given that we have Peter here, there's also a wealth of information on belbin.com, which will go through the site in probably even more exhaustive detail than belbin.ie can do. So don't be a stranger. If there's something that comes up from today's webinar that you'd like to talk about, please let us know, and we'll get back to you as quickly as we can. So on to the roles themselves, Rory. A team role is defined by Meredith Belbin as a tendency to behave or contribute and interrelate with others in a particular way. It's not just personality, it's how people act and perform in a particular role. It has been defined that 80% of a role is what people know and where people come from, and 20% is how they behave. But whether it's 20 or 80, that behavior and how they work makes a marked difference to the success of a team. Going on to the actual roles themselves, there are 9 Belbin team roles. For each role there is a contribution that is made, and there is what we describe as an allowable weakness. And that allowable weakness is something that has to be kept in mind. And the contribution is, if you like, the positive side. But viewing things in positive and negative doesn't really encapsulate the entire breadth of the particular role. It's important to look at these 9, and I'll go through them in a second, in lines of what we describe as 3 threes. There are 3 roles that are prominent, and they're roles with which you are most used to and most able to strengthen. There are 3 roles that you are less well supplied to deliver on, and they are roles that probably you need to pay attention to, the so-called allowable weaknesses. And there are 3 what we describe as manageable roles. So if you've done your Belbin accreditation and you've done your profiling, you'll see that those 3 come into that. Very quickly, because I'm trying to focus on recruitment for this webinar, we'll look at the roles as they're put here. The first role is a plant. Plants tend to be creative and imaginative. They generate ideas and can often solve difficult problems. However, they can sometimes ignore the incidentals, can sometimes not focus on how these problems can be resolved, and can be preoccupied to communicate less than effectively. The second role is the resource investigator. Outgoing, enthusiastic, communicative, looking for new ideas, principally outside the organization, but can be over-optimistic and lose interest once the initial enthusiasm for a project has passed. You will see, by the way, for those of you not familiar with the system, that each particular role has a little symbol. The plant has a light bulb, and the resource investigator has a phone, and that phone indicates their connection to the outside world. The third role is the coordinator, and the symbol here is a conductor. And that's pretty apt, because that's what a coordinator normally does. They're able to clarify goals, delegate. They're mature and they're confident. They're relied upon to deliver. But sometimes that can mean that their coordination always means that they manage to evade the difficult things. And sometimes some coordinators can make sure that the work that's really difficult perhaps sometimes goes to someone else. The fourth role is the shaper, and that's depicted by the whip. And effectively, they can be the driver. They're the people that every team needs to make things happen. They push. They're challenging. They're dynamic. They're pressurized, and they can often deliver pressure. But they have got the drive and the courage to make things happen. Sometimes, however, that drive can get in the way of smooth team relationships. They can provoke people and sometimes offend people's feelings without even knowing that they're doing it. The fifth role is the monitor-evaluator. And the monitor-evaluator, as you'll see, despite the fact that it's grey there, is the eye. It's someone keeping a beady look, not just on everything, but on things from different angles. They will look at a proposal, and rather than enthusing, as everybody might, as particularly a resource investigator or a shaper might, they will look at the issues. They will look at some of the challenges. And they can often bring that across in ways that others feel are less than inspiring, if not actually downright annoying. Because their drive is to look at things in terms of what might happen. Often you find that monitor evaluators can be seen to be pernickety and interfering. But in fact, a monitor evaluator, if he or she is allowed to flourish, can offer hugely useful insights to the rest of the team. So the role is absolutely invaluable. The next role is the team worker, so seen by the joining of hands. This is the person who lubricates the wheels of business, who makes sure that everybody feels okay and on side. The sort of person who would be brilliant in the United Nations, avoiding friction, always trying to be diplomatic, and prepared to listen and lend an ear to your gripes and groans. However, it can mean that they can be undecisive in certain situations, and they can avoid confrontation. And that's something that may mean that the team worker would be best working with other groups, which is, as his name suggests. The next section is the implementer, and that's, as you see, put together by the cogs in the wheel. This is the person who makes things happen. They're reliable, they're efficient. They turn the ideas and the practical into practicalities. They make things happen. They deliver projects. However, they can sometimes be quite blind to the delivery of the project and inflexible. It may make them difficult to respond to new possibilities and new situations. And that can mean that their concern is simply getting the project over the line rather than looking at the bigger picture. The eighth role is the role of the completer finisher. And we've indicated that by somebody who is tightening the screw. It's making all the little things right. And complete finishers tend to be absolutely dedicated to perfection. They are conscientious. They are painstaking. They are sometimes anxious. They're looking for the commas in a document. They're always trying to polish and perfect. But it can mean that they're never happy. And they're always worrying about how the smallest things can make a detail. It can also mean that they're reluctant to delegate because only they see themselves as being perfect and able to do everything to their required standards. The ninth role, and a role that was added later on in the process from Meredith Belbin's research, is that of the specialist. This is someone who is dedicated to a certain type of work or a certain project, a certain view, and tends to view the world through that. they can be hugely beneficial in terms of delivering really practical expertise to a project, but can sometimes only contribute on that front and may dwell purely on the technicalities of the system rather than its input. So there, in brief, is an introduction to the team roles. And Peter, I was wondering, was there anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I mean, that's a fairly, obviously succinct view. There's obviously a wider appreciation, but obviously to get the benefits of Belbin, it really is fundamentally understanding, I tend to call them almost these 9 ingredients. All of us have something to a lesser or greater extent of these 9 team roles within us. I think that's where sometimes where Belbin has been done poorly, you can just come out, oh, I'm a Belbin, and just mention one of the roles. Obviously within the individual, or in this case where we're looking for recruitment, in terms of perhaps looking at a position in terms of team roles, it's understanding the shape and the blend of these. So to use effectively, the more you understand these 9 ingredients, the better.
Okay. And you would agree in the 3, 3, and 3, the manageable, the allowable weaknesses, and the strong ones. And something of interest to me that I was only reading recently is that actually trying to control your allowable weaknesses may actually not be a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, if we're saying that there is something of the 9 within all of us, the most common view in terms of the shape of someone's profile is you tend to have 3 preferred, 3 manageable, 3 least preferred. And then it's almost what is your strategy personally for playing out. But obviously it then depends on your strength and depth and your shape. But people can come in all shapes and sizes, as we know, and you may have worked with some brilliant people. And depending on what they're really good at, it may mean that they are less good at other things, but also you have to make certain allowances because they are particularly good in whatever of these team roles. So they may be exceptional at 1 or 2, and the others fall away very quickly. So there's no right or wrongs when it comes to Belbin, and there's no necessarily good or bad combination. We can infer that within you sometimes you may feel depending on the combination. You may feel you've got an internal conflict going on, whereas you may have within you, all 3 relationship, all 3 of the, the other roles. If they come at the top, then you sit nice and neatly in, in one of those particular sub areas. But there's no right or wrong, which kind of makes it both interesting and fascinating, stroke frustrating. But at the same time, we're talking about people here, and it's not. Right. It's more of a moving science rather than a precise science. Thanks
for that. At this stage, anybody got any questions on the 9 team roles or the introduction part of the webinar? Okay. I can't see any.
No, I can't see who's there already. So
no, that's fine. Rory will let us know if anybody comes in. Again, you put your hands up if there are any issues, or send us a chat message. Okay, Rory, the next slide, please. All right, so this is an example of a team report, which is what you get when you actually put a team together with various different roles. And this is divided into 2, what is described as the self-perception plus the observer assessments. The self-perception, as its name suggests, is your view of yourself. And you will end up answering a questionnaire which will produce a report indicating what type of person you think you are. The observations, which we recommend are at an absolute minimum 4, and preferably 6, will give you a rounded picture. And so the difference between your self-perception and the observer assessments will give a rounded picture, which we have put in as overall. So if we take the example of Dave Blue, you can see that Dave Blue strongly believes he is a plant, and his observers do as well. So on an overall, he is seen to be a plant, coordinator, and completer finisher, which broadly agrees with both his self-perception and the observers. On the other hand, if you look at roles 7, 8, and 9, Dave is seen as a specialist, implementer, and a resource investigator. And again, with one exception, the observers and the self-perception is the same. So that gives an overall blended view of the team composition. And as we've done that for Dave Blue, so we can do with all the other colors down there. Each of them, to a greater or lesser extent, have got their self-perception and their observations. There may be some difference between them. In general, where we feel there's closeness between an observer and their self-perception, it has what we describe as a coherent profile. But there are occasions, of course, when there is a disjoint on that. So that gives each individual an overall view. And I think the next slide shows that pictorially. Please look. Okay. This takes the team and puts it into what we describe as the team roles circle. And I'm going to ask Peter in a second to look at social thinking and action, because some of those roles are important. But for the moment, if we just take a look in the center of that particular slide, you will see that there is very much a broad outline on this team. In other words, all the circles are filled. Someone has a prominent role in the team in each of the 9 circles. But you can see down there on the bottom right-hand side, the completer finisher, the brown polisher of roles. There are 3 people in this team who have strengths in the completer finisher area. So that would indicate a team that has a larger than normal number of completer finishers. For those not familiar, Peter, the social roles, the action roles, and the thinking roles.
Yep.
Could you give us a bit of background to those?
So John's introduced us to, obviously, that there are 9 Belbin Team roles, but they nicely split down into 3 subsections. And not only remembering, obviously, the 9 differences, but also that some combine together underneath what I would tend to call umbrella groups. So on the social, you can see on the left-hand side we have coordinators, team workers, and resource investigators. They're all people that like the relationship side overtly, and a way of probably they use their mouth most compared to other roles. It's not as if other roles don't talk. These are people who tend to overtly enjoy different types of relationships with people, whether it's the coordinator actually drawing the talent out, the team worker getting alongside people, and a resource investigator being much more outgoing in nature. On the opposite side in this circle, we've got the overtly thinking roles. It's not a case of our relationship people don't think. It's just that our thinkers are doing more of that and probably using their mouths less. So, you know, if you're a talker, you look across and you say, well, maybe so-and-so is very quiet. That's because their emphasis is what's going on in here. So your monitor evaluators are taking time to ponder things, and it's probably worth listening to them when they do say things. Or your thinkers may need to be in an office where they've got less going on. They may not appreciate your talkers so much. So if you've got kids that are different, they may say, you know, tell people to shut up on occasions because they haven't got time, you know, to think, or to plant the space and time to have the ideas. And then at the bottom are doers, are action-orientated people. So for them, it's getting things done. It's whether they roll their sleeves up and get involved, which may or may not be the case with shapers. They may just like to direct things. Or whether it's your implementers, perhaps organizing the bigger picture, and your completer finishers to take maybe an element of that, and they're the ones who will want to get their teeth into maybe their personal part of whatever this project and whatever role they're playing. So obviously it's useful here, you can see where you've got any gaps missing initially, and where obviously in this case, yes, we have 3 completer finishers. So is that a good thing? Is that too many? Is that where we sometimes have problems? And you can also see if we took one person out, well, what does that, I think this is what we're looking at with the recruitment, it's almost the case, well, if we took JP out,
yes,
what actually happens with this team? We lose an element of coordination and shaper. So it gives you a very quick view of seeing actually what have I got, what do I potentially need? It's not necessarily the case that unless there is work for the team that you need all 9 team roles. People fall into the trap of, do you need 9 people? Well, no, we can see in this case with 5 people, they're covering all the team roles to a lesser or greater extent. It's then saying, what is the team set up to do, as to how overtly do we need this covered? Do we need more or less people in certain areas? Or I can't change the number, can certain people step up? Or what happens if someone isn't?
Yeah, okay. And a good example of that is that if you have a number of completer finishers, for example, in a role where a great deal of precision is required, then obviously it makes sense for people who are weighted to that particular area. Equally, and I speak here as a proud resource investigator shaper, if you have somebody whose principal role is, say, sales and marketing, they're likely to be more outgoing, and that requires them to actually take a greater role. So a sales and marketing team may have a higher preponderance of shapers and resource investigators. So I agree totally with Peter. It's not a question of what is and everything having to be balanced. It's also a question of what the team needs to do. Okay, so that's a quick introduction to the team roles circle. Next slide, please, Rory. Okay. This again is a visual, and it looks at the difference between the self-perception and the observer assessments. And that's quite important because if there is a straight balance between the self-perception and the observer assessments, what that will mean is that the same shows. If you take a look at the individuals, which are the blue bars, the individuals all have higher, what we describe as percentile scores than the team. So an individual can be stronger in a given role than the team's average percentile. A question I'm often asked, Peter, and I've an opportunity to push you on this since you're here, without going into statistical medians, the percentiles, which is something I get a lot of questions about. In a profile such as that, where the individual percentile is higher than the team, what's the general advice you'd give in terms of feeding back?
Okay. I mean, what we're looking at here is primarily, let's say, if we looked at the complete finisher amount on the left-hand side, if everyone individually within the team scored in the 100th percentile, then obviously when we look at this graph, the red and the blue would match up. But obviously in this case, because you're taking a number of people and they don't all have the same percentile, you're averaging that out. So there's always, the red bar is always going to be probably below a blue one. What this is showing is the team average, that yes, overall there are probably a number of complete finishes there, but actually it will mention to us, well, who's the highest in this team. So it's kind of useful to know this information. Obviously, if the blue percentiles are all above 80, that's another criteria on another graph we use to actually indicate that they are probably very strong examples of that team role. They are in the top 20% of the norms database. So you could say if we were grading them as an exam, they're kind of your A-star example. They have the exceptional qualities to play that role. Whereas you can see for the team, maybe we've got a plant level for the individual, which actually is Dave Blue, that's at the 70th percentile. So you could still say, yeah, that's still a grade A, but if it's something where we actually feel we're lacking in ideas, they're not necessarily going to come from within this team. Do we need to look outside?
Right.
It's the kind of thing that are more heads better than one. In terms of plants, not necessarily, because they tend to be more individual animals. You don't tend to work on lots of ideas if you're a strong plant. In this case, they may be able to work things out from within the team. If that amount was lower, and we think we need ideas, well, then that leads to, well, where are we going to get them from? Perhaps we should look at getting someone into the team. There's no one in the company. Recruitment time.
Right. Good. And brilliantly, and in an entirely unscripted way, we move towards the recruitment section of this. So next slide, Victoria. Thank you. The observer responses, I'm going to quickly gloss over this. Those in italics would be seen to be ones that allowable weaknesses need to look at. Those not in italics would be, if you like, the points that are seen as generally most helpful. So creative, outgoing, helpful. And this is done for each of the observers. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's been a brief introduction to the actual team roles and a brief introduction to each of them. I repeat again that that's available in much greater detail on previous webinars, as well as on belbin.ie and belbin.com. And if you have any questions on those, of course, you're more than welcome to discuss them with us. But the second half, if you like, of this webinar is going to look at actually building on that, to show that there is so much more than simply your profiles and your teams. And it's been described as a little like a Swiss Army knife. Belbin is, in fact, much more than just a team-building tool. And we're about to show some examples of what can be covered. Next slide, please, Rory. And let's run them all through so we can see them all. So if you start to take a look at the entire range of offerings that Belbin can give you, it's way more than a profile or even a team report. If I start on the left-hand side, we look at self-awareness and personal effectiveness. And of itself, that is hugely useful, the self-perception and the observers. If you look at what you know about yourself and ally it to what your colleagues, superiors, those who work for you, those who have a great deal of influence, suppliers and stakeholders, you'll get a really good rounded picture of yourself. And that will enable you to look at the 3 strong roles, the 3 allowable weaknesses roles, and the manageable roles in the middle. But that's a little like having an army knife and opening up 1 orange when there are 25 oranges available. It's a good start, but there's a lot more you can look at. The next is team selection and development, and we're going to focus on this in great depth, so I'll quickly pass through it. Mutual trust and understanding between the team is clearly important, and if a team knows itself as an individual and as a team, it's likely to develop that trust and understanding. You will know a person's strengths and their allowable weaknesses and be able to understand them. You can also potentially, if you're selling to them, for example, cast the proposition in the light of their roles. Consider, for example, the difference between selling a service to someone who's a monitor evaluator and who looks at everything from different angles, to someone who's a shaper. If the shaper gets it, your job is likely to be done. If a monitor evaluator is sitting down opposite you, they're going to look at all the angles. So it does build a different perception as to how you meet people, both within your team and externally. They're different. Management training and development, fairly obviously, can use that particular role, because you could look at people's strengths and their allowable weaknesses. And from that, personal development and career planning can come. Indeed, it's pretty usual to have a report where the Belbin roles are seen as part of any proper performance analysis process. And finally, on an organizational basis, a broad picture of the organization analysis and the type of people who work for the company can easily be seen as something that's useful for planning, not just in HR, but in a wider variety of things. But for today, we're going to look at the very bottom middle section, matching people to the right jobs. If you know your profile, then you'll know how you can use it. Let's take a look at them all. Your awareness of behavior, your coaching, your career development, how you can change, how you can review your team's performance and improve in it, the balanced team, which we talked about, in terms of seeing what skills are required across the piece, your culture, the recruitment process, how you induce people into the organization, how you develop them once they come into the organization, what type of roles or projects you assign for them, and how you try and mollify or sort issues out when things get difficult. So you can see almost from there, there's a whole breadth of use within an organization once you have the Belbin role. Now, we're going to focus on 3 reports that are important, and while Peter is getting them set up, I'm going to pose, while Rory gets them set up, I'm going to pose a question to Peter. These 3 reports, the working relationships, the job reports, and the job comparisons. Typically, we'd start by using this at the start of the recruitment process. So let's suppose I wanted to hire an IT person. Can you talk to me about eligibility and suitability and the type of person you'd be looking for in a report like that?
Okay. Well, obviously, the things that are easiest to understand in any recruitment process is probably what are the skills, qualifications, perhaps experience that we're looking for. So obviously, that's almost the eligibility side. What does someone need to have to be able to, I suppose, function within this job? But obviously, what can be equal, or in this day and age, perhaps more important, I'm sure all of you can highlight cases where perhaps someone has been recruited and it hasn't been the right fit for whatever reason. So we may then need to consider what is the fit with a job. If it's a very unique or sole job, that may be more key. There may be other elements also to the fit with perhaps people existing within either the organization or a department or a team, or perhaps an actual fit with a particular person if they have to work very closely. But what qualities do they need to have? And potentially, the qualities for a relationship with manager may be less important initially, but so there were sort of 3 elements potentially to consider. But obviously, perhaps the easiest one, or the one to understand, is, well, I've got a feeling of what eligibility I'm looking for. But also, I want to get an understanding of what are the suitability issues. And it's suitability where basically Belbin is all about suitability.
Yes. Okay. Let's take a look at that report in some detail, please. And if we scroll down to the team descriptions, this is for Peter Green, and he's head of training. What would you say, Peter, having looked at that, what would your comments be in terms of the suitability of this candidate for the role?
Okay. So in this case, on the right-hand side, what we're looking at is actually we've already sat down where it's got with the heading head of training. We've sat down with a manager and we've actually used the profiling part of Belbin we call job requirements. But we've sat down with a manager and there are 16 factors that they were graded, and they go from A to E. You have to grade every factor, and you have to say whether this quality within the job role is essential, through to actually know it's irrelevant, or give it an E, it's actually unhelpful.
Mm-hmm.
So based upon those 16 factors, and the manager then also lists what are their top 3, it gives us this job profile that you can see on the left-hand side. So we don't give it any scale. If you haven't graded things that high, obviously the graph is more, I suppose, depressed in its view. In this case, we're saying that the most helpful team roles to have is really someone who's probably a good coordinator, a monitor evaluator, and then shaper, resource investigator. Obviously, you can see a bit of a break. Then it's actually dropping down, and probably the ones that aren't necessarily so key for this job role are team worker, implementer, plant, complete finisher, and actually what would be potentially unhelpful is being an overt specialist. So that's certainly someone. So almost you could say there are 4 combination of roles that we're looking for, those top 4, and there's 5 that aren't so key within this particular role that a manager is stipulated. So even before we get to this part of comparison, you can actually sit with a manager and just talk to them, and it helps to open up and perhaps widen take the blinkers off and focusing on eligibility to also understand the factors of what's or elements to be able to do this job effectively. And for many jobs, actually the eligibility may not be so important. Suitability is key. I personally believe we live in a world where that is more so. When we come to then take that job, and let's say as a recruitment process we've got Peter Green to complete, or maybe he's an internal person, which is probably more the case because we've also collected observers on Peter in this report, is we're looking at here taking the job profile and comparing Peter's profile to the job. So he does have some elements of it, but you can see initially that actually he's got more of the elements that are in the lower half of our job specification that are his strengths. So he's not a natural fit. It doesn't mean that he couldn't actually do the job. Actually, he probably could, but actually he's probably not the right fit. You can see his strengths are in team worker, RI, computer finisher, and then we've got this big gap. So his preferred roles are those three, whereas actually they are the preferred roles of what we're looking for. So Peter's probably not the right person for the job. If we're looking at it, even if he thinks he is, it is not what the manager is looking for at this initial stage. So he's better off probably doing other things and not in this particular role.
I mentioned earlier, Peter, about the opposites attract issue. And one would assume when the head of training role is being discussed by the manager and the hirer, that if you have a good knowledge of profiles and team roles, then you would specify that the head of training coming into, say, HR or IT department would have a balanced input. Hence, the need for a coordinator, a monitor, or evaluator could be the role itself, or also potentially how they fit into the team. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, yes, I think on the whole, again, in this process, it has to be considered, like I said, the three different aspects of how individual is this role, almost the contact with other people and their fit with others. In here, you're asking for almost that combination of coordinator and monitor evaluator, someone who's almost a bit more of a draw and place people, and also we can look at things in a slightly considered and shrewd manner with a bit of drive and a bit of networking. But you're saying it's really that combination of coordinator, ME is what I'm looking for. Whereas in a different organisation, someone else may have a different view of what they perceive as the head of training. So actually a job title in any organisation masks how you want someone to go about that particular role.
Okay. All right. Any questions at this stage, Rory, from anyone? Or does anybody else wish to make a comment?
This is fairly kind of almost advanced stuff with Belbin we're looking at, but actually it's almost the fundamentals of where Belbin should really fit. In our view, obviously as an organisation, it's almost people use Belbin for individuals and teams, and sometimes don't think of it for the recruitment element, where actually its history and its origin is actually to do with putting it into understanding the issues of suitability when you're actually bringing people in or considering. If you can get that right, it actually pays dividends in making sure that things perhaps don't go wrong.
Okay. And there would be, I presume, in your example, there would be some organizations who do use it for recruitment.
I mean, yes, we have some who obviously swear by it as a tool, and this is it's like with anything. It's using the right tool in the right situation, and obviously using that tool in the appropriate manner. So this isn't the be-all and end-all. You can work with managers. It's getting managers to think, and also it's a very flexible and very easy tool, friendly tool to use. But if you understand the team roles and the 9 ingredients, then it makes it easier to work with managers in HR, or even to consider things, even if you don't do the job profiling, you're just profiling people for recruitment, that it becomes a very flexible tool to basically understand everything around suitability.
Okay. All right, so that's the job report, and so we have the head of training and Peter Green. I think if we move on to the next report, please, Rory. And if any further questions, again, let me know.
They're quite a bunch.
Mm. So working relationships.
Yeah.
Now, in this one, you really, are you not comparing the relationship between, it could be a superior and the person who works with them, it could be another team member. So in this case, we have Joe Pink and Dave Blue. And pretty obviously, these two may be slightly different. But that can be a good or a bad thing. So looking at it, what's your initial view on this one, Peter?
It's really, I mean, the report itself, the first paragraph underneath the graphic compares Joe's top role as coordinator, which we can see is right up there. But this is looking at a combination of self and observer material on her. So she's within the top 1%. She is an extremely proficient coordinator, and it's comparing that against Dave Blue's plant amount. So it's saying almost her view of being a more generalist coordinator versus the ideas that are coming through from Dave. There's almost how is that combination going to get on, and in this case it's also taking into account of the factor that Joe manages Dave, which may or may not be a real situation.
Yes.
So this, you can look at either existing, or you can look at it for what I'm thinking of these people, working together. What is it to actually try and recognise or supplying people with this information if Joe is going into more of a management role? I mean, on the whole, probably coordinator with anything is probably going to say quite beneficial because they already have an eye for how to draw the best out of people. They're not interested in almost creating conflict situations. So it's probably always going to be a favourable outcome when it's coordinator or perhaps even something like team worker. So the first paragraph kind of deals with that combination. And the second paragraph underneath actually deals with maybe you could say it's almost the contrasting styles of leadership. Joe's shaper amount compared to Dave's coordinator. One slightly less than the other. So they're two different types of predominantly leadership styles. So it may just give a little bit, as it does here, a little sort of caveat to say that one may be want to be more consultative. The other, if push comes to shove, Joe's going to shove a bit with her shaper.
Yes.
And then underneath that, on the Belbin report, we just always have some standard questions just to get you to kind of think a bit about what we're looking at. But it's almost once you understand the ingredients, you can quickly see just by looking at the profile, that Joe's an out-and-out coordinator, shaper, RI. Dave has got some more general qualities. He's not up as high, but he can turn his hand to a mixture of things.
Yeah.
And you sort of have to take that into consideration. So the report gives you some pointers, but the more you know, and hence it's always good to kind of take a wider view or further training in Belbin, because it's then your eye in drawing things out of the report that you're looking at.
I mean, what strikes me there is, for instance, that Dave Blue, who perhaps should actually have been titled Dave Red for the purposes of this particular exercise, but that's another day's work. Dave Blue is quite a strong completer finisher. Would that mean that, for instance, there's a balance there if the two of them are in either complementary or subordinate roles, where a potential weakness of a shaper, driver, coordinator could be alleviated by somebody who's very detail-oriented?
Yeah, potentially. I think it depends on the focus of where the two. It's almost clearer from Joe's where exactly she wants to sit. Whereas from Dave's, because he's got a number of roles, it really depends where he wants to concentrate as to whether he can turn his hand to other things, or whether he's working in a plant mode, or actually he's coordinating a bit more of a project. do the other team roles in his armory enhance, or could perhaps impinge into how many roles he wants to play? Right. That's always another thing to consider in terms of where do you draw the line personally, either working with someone or taking on, you could say, well, Dave can do everything. But is that healthy for the relationship? Whereas you could look at Joe's and you go, well, Joe can't do everything. It's slightly more black and white. Whereas Dave, you can see we're down at that kind of, not quite necessarily jack of all trades, master of none. It's deciding where you actually sit all that help and guidance.
Okay. And I would assume also that in using this working relationships report, you would obviously tie it in with the self-perception report for both of the individuals. And if Joe and Dave are in a wider team, you'd need to look at the team report as well, wouldn't you, to get a truly rounded view?
Yeah, which is what we've dealt with on a couple of slides, but there is also other additional information. But each report where we're looking either an individual or combining data slightly sort of shines a slightly different light on it. So it's always the same data, it's just putting a slightly different, and it's knowing which report or how to draw out or highlight what is it that we want. Otherwise you can be swamped by sort of too much information, which we try not to do. We try to give a balance of graphic and text.
Okay. So that's the working relationships report. And the final one we're going to go through today is the job comparisons report. And again, any more questions from anybody? Seeing any here?
I don't see any questions.
What we're looking at is analysis from a manager.
Sorry, Peter, say again?
No, I was just going to say what we're looking at here is obviously the analysis that maybe you have done initially for the manager. So we're almost going back a step. This is what we would have sat and worked with, and there's two types of reports that come out, almost one based around the team roles based for job specification. So this is broadly what I specified, or depends if I'm the trainer and John's the manager. He sat down and either he's completed this online independently, or else perhaps we've worked through it on paper and then actually onto the system. So there are a number of ways you can do this. It always needs to be analysed to produce a coherent report. And you get, first of all, this is what you've broadly specified, and then the next page of the report, if you really like it, it could potentially go to any potential job holder and say, this is what is broadly expected of you, within this particular role. If you like it, if you appreciate the material that much.
So you would use this at the start of a recruitment process?
Yeah, it's the easiest place to start because you're working with the manager, saying almost what is in your head, which in some cases may or may not be easy to extract, particularly depending on what their team roles are and what their level of age, experience, other things. Belbin gives you almost a benchmarking process, as we can do it for individuals and for teams based on the individual information. We can then use the Belbin job profiles to help us get a view from both the manager's point of view, and what we're looking at on the screen now is also that you're able to ask, in this case we can ask other people that maybe know the job well, or perhaps who have even done the job, what they feel are the qualities that are most needed, which are the ones listed at the top here, and obviously the ones that are zeros are ones that people haven't ticked. So you're asking people what you feel is the same list of observable words, hence we can do a correlation match between what people feel the qualities needed within the job compared to what qualities potentially the individual. If we look back at that Peter Green comparison, job suitability, it actually said he had these qualities, but however it would have been useful to have also had, and that's where that information comes from, because we collected the observers. So if we scroll to the last paragraph, So it says Peter is seen as having the behavioural qualities, and it lists they are seizes opportunities, encouraging of others. Those are some of the qualities that probably fit within, identified within the resource investigator amount. However, there are other qualities, which some of those are related to the coordinator. Looking at where coordinator comes in Peter's profile, it's in 6th position, whereas the job is requiring it in 1st. That would be beneficial. So I think at the end of the day, Peter is not really your man for the job. He's a good man, but not the man for this particular, and not everyone can play everyone's role, which hopefully everyone listening out there understands.
Yeah, and I wanted to bring that to a wider discussion, really, which is to say this eligibility versus suitability debate, which a lot of people in Belbin have discussed, and I think it's extremely important. It could well be that Peter is highly qualified, is eligible, has many, many years of experience.
Yep.
Bring. So on paper, he may be the obvious candidate. But the suitability factor, which has been carefully planned by the recruiter and the hirer, and possibly by the stakeholders of the job, would indicate that in this particular culture, in this particular area, they're not right. And I noticed you said 2 or 3 times during the webinar that suitability may even be more important than eligibility. So would it be fair to say then that, in fact, eligibility would almost be a given, a first cut, and that suitability would be used early, once the eligibility has been agreed, as a sort of a secondary factor to look through the candidates? And it may be that, say, before an interview seriously starts, the suitability is used on top of the eligibility.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of companies use, if they've worked with, they've got the job profile, specification and expectations. If they like not only the graphic, but perhaps the text that's used with those, you could obviously use some of that text to word a more relevant job advertisement. So that then, yes, you are perhaps listing some factors of eligibility that may be key, but you're also saying it would also be useful to have, and you're using those as a subtle, so I may read that advertisement and say, well, I haven't quite got all the eligibility, but I like the sound of the job, so I will apply.
Right.
So it is getting that balance where if you purely use the eligibility, you maybe get a lot of people who perhaps don't fit, but you don't know that yet. But
Yes.
it's almost broadening the horizons of what you're looking at and what you're looking for, but trying to then boil it down into something that is more concise for what we're looking for in this particular instance.
Okay. All right. Any further questions at this stage?
They've obviously all got it, John. They're all
Well, it looks very, very good, and we are coming up to 1 o'clock, so
yeah.
That's absolutely fine. If there are no further questions, I will I'll propose to them. Rory, anything else to add, or anybody make any comments?
No comments, just Dinfna had to leave about 15 minutes ago, that was all. Yeah, I don't see any questions there.
Okay, fine. Okay, Peter, at this stage I'll close the session. May I first of all thank you very much for your attendance and questions. If there are any things that come out of it, we'll be delighted to let you see them. To those still on the call, there will be another Belbin webinar in the early part of 2015, and we will be on the belbin.ie site. We will be advertising that and asking you to share. So quite amazingly, on the 4th of December, may I take the opportunity to wish all of the attendees, whether they are actually online now or are watching this broadcast after it is completed, a early but nevertheless thoroughly hearty, happy Christmas. We look forward to seeing you in 2015. And again, if there's anything on Belbin that has interested you in any way, shape or form, do let us know. So on behalf of Belbin Ireland, can I say thanks again to Peter. Thanks, Peter.
You're welcome, John.
and a very happy Christmas. And we'll leave it there for the moment. Thanks a million. Bye-bye.
Okay.